You know, there are moments in the life of a nation where everybody needs to stop, take a breath, and really look at what just happened. Not through the lens of who you voted for, not through the lens of cable news, but through the lens of what this means for the country you're going to hand to your children. What we've just witnessed between the United States and Iran. This 2-week ceasefire announced in the final 90 minutes before a presidential deadline to launch devastating strikes. That is one of those moments. Now, look, I've been in that chair. I know what it feels like when the clock is ticking and millions of lives hang on a decision that only one person can make. I faced it with North Korea in 1994. I faced it in Bosnia. I faced it every single time we had to decide whether American power would be used wisely or recklessly. And let me tell you something, the gravity of those moments never leaves you. It shouldn't leave any president. So when I look at what's unfolding right now, a fragile ceasefire already showing cracks, both sides claiming total victory, our closest allies publicly contradicting the terms, and attacks still being reported across the Gulf even as the ink dries. I don't see a triumph. I see a country that was taken to the edge of something catastrophic and pulled back at the last second without a clear plan for what comes next. And that should concern every American. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, what's in this deal, and where I believe this is heading, because some of the details here are going to surprise you, and we'll come back to those in a moment. But first, we've got to understand the road that brought us here, because none of this happened in a vacuum. Now, to understand where we are today, you've got to understand the road that brought us here, because this didn't start last Tuesday. This started a long time ago. Back in 2015, the United States, along with our European allies, Russia and China, negotiated the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Now, look, was it a perfect agreement? No, no deal of that magnitude ever is. I'll be the first to tell you that. But it did something essential. It froze Iran's nuclear program under the most intrusive international inspection regime ever designed. It gave us eyes inside their facilities, and it kept the door open for diplomacy, for engagement, for the slow, unglamorous work of building a more stable Middle East. Then in 2018, President Trump pulled out. He tore up the deal, said he'd get a better one. And here's what happened instead. Iran started enriching uranium again. They went from 3.67%, 67% to 60% and beyond. Every guardrail we had built, gone. Every inspector we had inside, sidelined. And the world watched as the single most effective non-proliferation agreement of the 21st century was discarded. Not because it failed, but because it had somebody else's name on it. Fast forward to February 2026, the United States, alongside Israel, launched a military campaign against Iran. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway about as wide as the English Channel, where 20% of the world's oil passes through every single day, became the chessboard. Iran closed it. Oil prices spiked. Global markets shuttered. Shipping routes that keep food and fuel moving to ordinary people around the world were suddenly held hostage to a conflict that could have been avoided. And then Pakistan of all countries, stepped in as mediator. Iran put forward a 10-point plan. The US had its own 15-point maximalist proposal. And somewhere between those two documents, in the final 90 minutes before a presidential deadline, we got a 2-week ceasefire. And this is where things start to get complicated. Let me walk you through what's actually in this deal, because the details matter more than the headlines. Iran published a 10-point ceasefire framework. Here's what it includes. A U.S. commitment to ensure no further acts of aggression against Iran. Continued Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. Acceptance, and I want you to really hear this word, acceptance of Iran's nuclear enrichment rights, lifting of all primary sanctions, lifting of all secondary sanctions, termination of all United Nations Security Council resolutions against Iran, termination of all International Atomic Energy Agency, Board of Governors resolutions against Iran, payment of damages to Iran for losses in the war, withdrawal of U.S. combat, bad forces from the region, and cessation of hostilities on all fronts, including Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. Now, the White House has not formally signed on to all 10 points. President Trump called it a workable basis on which to negotiate, But here's the honest truth. When you accept someone's framework as your starting point for negotiations, you've already given them enormous leverage. That's negotiation 101. And there's another piece. Trump has floated a so-called joint venture for the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran charges a toll reportedly up to $2 million per ship, and the US somehow shares in the revenue. Reuters estimated this could be worth $500 billion to Iran over time. Before this war, the strait was open. International waters, free passage. Now we're talking about a toll booth run by the country we just went to war with. Now look, when both sides claim they won, that tells you one of two things. Either both sides are lying, or the deal is so vague that neither side really knows what they agreed to. And folks, neither of those is good. Iran's Supreme National Security Council already said this ceasefire does not signal an end to the war. That's not the language of a country that surrendered. That's the language of a country that believes it got what it wanted and is waiting for more. Now, let me be clear about something. I am not criticizing the existence of a ceasefire. Anytime bombs stop falling and people stop dying, that is a good day. I learned that in Bosnia. I learned that at Camp David. I believe it in my bones. What I am criticizing is the process, the reckless seat of the Pence leadership that got us to this point. When we were working on the Dayton Accords in 1995, we spent months building the architecture before anyone sat down at the table. Richard Holbrooke wore himself to the bone doing back-channel diplomacy. We coordinated with our NATO allies. We consulted Congress. We had clear objectives and we had fallback positions because that's what responsible crisis management demands. What we saw here was something different. We saw a president posting on social media that a whole civilization will die tonight. We saw self-imposed 800 p.m. deadlines announced to the world like a reality television countdown. We saw America's negotiating position exposed for every adversary on earth to study. And then in the final hour, we saw a scramble, a frantic last-minute scramble to accept terms that by any honest measure look a lot more like Iran's wish list than America's opening bid. And it wasn't just Democrats who saw it. Republican Congressman Austin Scott from Georgia, a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee, publicly criticized this approach. Senator Lindsey Graham called for congressional review. Even Laura Ingraham on Fox News questioned whether the president fully understood the complexity of what he was dealing with. When Laura Ingraham is asking those questions, folks, we've got to pay attention. Let me tell you something. The strength of American diplomacy has never been about who talks loudest. It's about who prepares best, who builds the broadest coalition, and who keeps their word. You don't tweet ultimatums and then hope somebody blinks. That's not diplomacy. That's gambling. And when you're gambling with the lives of American service members and the stability of the global economy, the stakes are too high for improvisation. Now, I want to broaden the lens a little because the problem here isn't just one deal or one ceasefire. The problem is what this episode reveals about the erosion of the guardrails that keep American democracy functioning. Start with Congress. The United States launched a war against Iran, a sovereign nation, a major regional power without a formal declaration of war, without a new authorization for the use of military force. The last time I checked, Article 1 of the Constitution gives that power to Congress, not to one person's social media account. And it wasn't just Democrats raising this concern. Senator Graham, a man who has rarely met a military intervention, he didn't support without their calling for congressional oversight. That tells you something about how far outside the normal process this went. Then look at the State Department. Where were the professional diplomats? Where was the career foreign service that has spent decades building relationships and institutional knowledge in the Middle East? They were sidelined. And when you sideline the experts, you end up negotiating in a crisis without the people who know the terrain. That's like performing surgery without a surgeon in the room. Look at our allies. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was visiting the White House the day the ceasefire was announced. And by all accounts, he was as surprised as everyone else. Our European allies are scrambling to figure out what this deal means for their energy security. Israel says Lebanon isn't included in the ceasefire. Pakistan says it is. Iran says it is. The United States hasn't clearly said one way or the other. When your own allies can't agree on what you just agreed to, you don't have a deal. You have confusion. We've got to remember something. The problem isn't just the drama. It's that we're running the most powerful country in the world. Like, the drama is the product and the details are somebody else's problem. And institutions, Congress, the State Department, our alliances, international law, those are the shock absorbers of democracy. When you wear them down, the whole vehicle starts shaking. Now, there's another dimension to this that I want to address because it matters. And that's the gap between what's being sold to the American public and what's actually happening on the ground. So President Trump took to True Social and declared, and I'm paraphrasing here, total and complete victory, 100%. He said China persuaded Iran to make a deal. He said Iran's uranium stockpile would be perfectly taken care of. He floated this idea of a joint venture for the Strait of Hormuz as if the United States just co-signed a business deal instead of ending a war we started. And then Fox News ran with it. Laura Ingraham called it a defining moment. Pete Hegseth called it a real chance at peace. Commentators were calling it a home run, a golden age for the Middle East. Now, I respect that people have different views, and I understand that every network has its perspective, but here's where it gets troubling. At the very same time, and this is important, Iran's state media was broadcasting to its own people that this was a U.S. retreat, a withdrawal, a capitulation. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said the ceasefire does not signal an end to the war. Iranian officials were celebrating in the streets of Tehran. Both propaganda machines cannot be right, and the American people deserve better than competing spin cycles that obscure what's really happening. Meanwhile, look at what's actually happening on the ground. Netanyahu put out a statement saying the ceasefire does not include Lebanon, and Israeli strikes on Beirut continued. The UAE and Bahrain reported incoming missiles even during the ceasefire's first hours. 400 ships remain stranded around the strait. Oil prices are still elevated. Here's the honest truth. You can win the press conference and lose the peace. I've seen it happen, and I'm worried that's exactly where we're heading, because the metric of success for a president should never be the news cycle. It should be the strategic outcome measured in stability, in credibility, and whether the world is actually safer when the cameras turn off. So let me share with you how I see this playing out, because I think there are essentially three roads ahead, and the one we end up on depends on choices that haven't been made yet. The first possibility, and I want to be honest, I give this the lowest odds, is that this ceasefire holds. The Islamabad talks produce a real framework, and both sides make genuine concessions. Iran agrees to meaningful limits on enrichment under international inspection. The U.S. gets a structured withdrawal with security guarantees for our allies. The Strait of Hormuz returns to genuine free navigation. It's possible, but only if professional diplomats are allowed to take the lead, if Congress is brought into the process, and if both sides come to the table with something more than talking points. I'm not holding my breath, but I don't rule it out. The second possibility, and I think this is the most likely, is what I'd call the muddle-through scenario. The ceasefire partially holds. The terms stay ambiguous. The strait reopens, conditionally with de facto Iranian control and this toll system that could bring Tehran $100 billion a year in revenue. The conflict enters a frozen state, not peace, not war, just a slow burn with periodic flare-ups. And here's the danger of that. It leaves Iran structurally stronger, U.S. credibility weakened, our alliances frayed, and the Middle East no more stable than it was before a single bomb fell. Working families in Ohio and Arkansas end up paying more for gas and groceries while Iran builds leverage. The third possibility, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, is collapse. The ceasefire disintegrates. Netanyahu continues strikes in Lebanon. Gulf states push back. Iran declares the terms violated, and President Trump faces the exact same impossible choice in 2 weeks that he faced last Tuesday, except now with less credibility, less leverage, and a world that has already watched America blink. The next 72 hours are going to tell us a lot. Watch what happens with the shipping lanes. Watch what Israel does in Lebanon. Watch whether the Islamabad talks actually convene or quietly fall apart. That will tell you which road we're on. Now, let me close with this because I think it's the most important thing I can say tonight. I do not oppose diplomacy with Iran. I never have. I believe in diplomacy the way I believe in democracy, not because it's easy, but because the alternatives are worse. Every meaningful peace agreement in modern history was negotiated with people we had deep disagreements with. That's what makes it diplomacy and not a surrender ceremony. But diplomacy must be serious. It must be structured. It must be accountable to the American people through their elected representatives. And it must be built on something more durable than one person's instinct in a moment of crisis. What concerns me about what we've just witnessed isn't the ceasefire itself. It's the pattern of governance by spectacle, the pattern of threats followed by concessions dressed up as victories, the pattern of sidelining institutions and allies, and then wondering why the deal falls apart before the ink is dry. That pattern doesn't make America stronger, it makes us unpredictable. And in international affairs, unpredictable is not the same as strong. It's dangerous. The strength of America was never just our military, and Lord knows we have the finest military the world has ever seen. Our strength was our ability to build coalitions, to keep our word, to lead with a combination of power and principle that made other nations want to stand with us. That reputation is not inexhaustible. It can be spent. And right now, I'm concerned we're spending it faster than we're earning it. But I want to end on a note of genuine hope because I believe in this country. I've seen us in tough spots before. I've seen moments when it looked like the wheels were coming off, and every single time it was the decency and the common sense of the American people that pulled us through. The Republic endures not because of any one president, Democrat or Republican, but because citizens demand accountability, because institutions reassert themselves, and because the American idea is bigger than any single crisis. So, I'd ask you tonight, pay attention, call your representative, ask hard questions, demand transparency, hold every leader, including the ones you voted for, to the standard that American lives and American credibility require. We've been through harder things than this. And I genuinely still believe in